If there were one word to sum up The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, it would be this: playground. This massive adventure spans over 3 worlds, teeming with opportunities and adventures to be had. There are breathtaking sights to behold, wondrous vehicles and contraptions to craft, immense treasures to discover, and a wide variety of fiendish creatures to battle. From the sky above to the dungeons below, Tears of the Kingdom invites players to lose themselves in another grand adventure in the Zelda-verse. Released on the back of a highly successful addition to the franchise, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom came to stores May 2023 to high expectations and even higher acclaim. Even before players got their hands on it, review after review listed it as 10 out of 10, like its predecessor. But was this the predictable activity of insider reviewers keen for their early access and preferential treatment? Or was this the second perfect Zelda game in as many releases? In my Breath of the Wild review, I pointed to several areas I felt the game was well short of perfection. Some areas that I could argue Tears of the Kingdom did improve upon, but also areas in which Tears of the Kingdom stuck true without any improvement at all. Personally, I've completed 3 playthroughs, 2 of which I did with all shrines and light routes completed. I've learned from my experience with 100%ing Breath of the Wild that doing so again is a bad idea, especially since there's much more to do this time around. I endeavoured to examine the features of this game with as little bias as possible, though it's nearly impossible to eliminate it altogether. For this review, I'll be examining the gameplay, music and sounds, as well as the world and lore. I will be including both praise and criticism, so if you came just to hear someone slobber all over it, or to hear someone bag it out for an hour, you've come to the wrong place. Let's jump right in. Like its predecessor, Tears of the Kingdom does not coddle players with endless tutorials or micromanage movement with waypoints that map journeys on a step-by-step basis. Instead, it generally leaves the player free to create their own unique story and institutes hints in the form of NPCs, basic skill tests and shrines, and tiny pop-ups in the corner of the screen. The gameplay is split into 4 pursuits: main quests, side adventures, side quests, and shrine quests. Did you get all that?
Follow me, camera guy?
Now, I had to look up what the difference between side quests and side adventures was, because it wasn't immediately obvious to me, nor was the reason why there needed to be 2 classifications for side quests anyway. What I found was this: side adventures can involve multiple steps, but are generally shorter than main quests. Side quests usually feature a relatively simple objective, such as finding a specific item or defeating designated foes. However, even if you are not actively engaged in either of the previously mentioned 4 pursuits, there is a lot to see in this game. These include, but are not limited to, exploring environments, gathering resources, discovering caves and other secret spots, participating in minigames, testing your might against a wide variety of creatures, and other things as well. Difficulty-wise, Tears of the Kingdom is slightly more difficult than Breath of the Wild. This is down to a wider variety of enemies and the different strategies needed to defeat them. The larger world and just a few game design choices that I will mention later on also contribute to this extra difficulty. Many things return from Breath of the Wild, including great fairy fountains, shrines, stables, horses, cooking pots, enemy camps, to name a few. But we also have new locations and mechanics, including caves, skyview towers, chasms, different collectibles like Pose, light routes, gloom, zonite, just to name a few. And Link has new powers now. Ultra Hand, bestowing Link with the ability to grab and move just about anything and connect that thing with just about anything else. The possibilities are endless. It has some similarities with Magnesis, with its ability to lift things out of water or the ground or reveal doorways. However, it's far more versatile. Firstly, it works on more than just metal objects. Secondly, it glues things onto other things to make yourself a vehicle or some other ungodly contraption. Thirdly, anything can be turned into a vehicle with a control stick. The way this feature was implemented screams simplicity, in a good way. It's very straightforward and allows new players to easily figure it out and enjoy it. The only downside to this that I would say is that trying to create something from scratch can be quite tedious. Having to flip the objects around can be time consuming, and the fixed camera when joining objects together makes for a guessing game as to whether or not you've placed it in the right position. Oftentimes the camera angle is the worst part of Ultra Hand, and I'm not sure how the restriction adds anything to the process. Additionally, we have the fuse power. Adding to creativity of Ultra Hand is the ability to fuse two things together to make a weapon or a shield. You can create truly monstrously powerful weapons, or really silly creations that bounce enemies off ledges or burn them to a crisp. You can tell that the developers really put crafting at the forefront of the design philosophy of this game. One could argue that this feature wouldn't work in Breath of the Wild, as the weapons in that game already had plenty of attack power. So the devs made most weapons suffer from decay in order to push the player into fusing weapons. Not sure that the decay feature was really necessary though. Just design weapons to be weaker now. Is that the sort of thing that needs to be explained to players? I mean, you didn't bother explaining where all the Divine Beasts and Guardians went, but sure, the players would be upset if we didn't explain why weapons got a debuff. We know, your in-world explanation is unnecessary and kind of doesn't make sense either, but I digress. In short, fusing is fun and creative, a big plus. Then there's recall, the ability to turn back time with a click of a button, but only on one object. What a weird and incredible power to have. This works itself not only into the puzzles and the shrines, but into the three worlds of Tears of the Kingdom as well. However, its use in the three worlds is limited, being used for two main things: to throw things back at enemies, and to reverse debris falling from the sky so you can get high. Out of all the power Link receives in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, recall is probably the least applied to the actual worlds outside the shrines. The last power of the first four powers Link receives in Tears of the Kingdom is Ascend, but it really should be called Godsend, because this power is just the best. Being more free from the tedious climbs compared to Breath of the Wild had me almost on the verge of tears. No pun intended. As much as climbing adds to the freedom of both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, it's boring. Anything that alleviates the time and pain that goes into climbing is a massive plus. And it's incredible how many times you can forget that you can use it. This might just be the legacy of playing Breath of the Wild, but I found myself many a time saying, why am I trying to climb out of this cave when I can just ascend? There are additional powers like the auto build, which is self-explanatory, and the camera, which we've had previously and is also self-explanatory. The puzzle designs in Tears of the Kingdom takes a lot of inspiration from Breath of the Wild. You can definitely see very similar game design philosophy in the approach to puzzles. There are things that act the same. Environments that can burn or freeze, metal objects that conduct electricity, gravity affecting everything. These are straightforward. But there's more to this similar design philosophy. The idea that shrines and puzzles can be completed in various ways returns as well. I argue that this was worse in Breath of the Wild, because generally shrines had a good and fast way to finish them, and then several other very slow ways. With Tears of the Kingdom, they addressed this ever so slightly, with more variety in the shrines and more creativity in game features that can be applied to the completion of said shrines, such as unique vehicle designs that can get you to the end of a path. I often reverted to moving an object up and down, getting on said object, then using recall. I'm not sure if this was an alternative way, and I hope there are others out there like me, but it did at times feel like I was cheesing it. The combat system has pretty much not changed. Apart from the change of weaponry and powers, Link can still use stealth to sneak up on opponents and conduct a sneak strike, implement strafing, blocking, and sprinting to defend against one or more enemies, eating loads of foods in the middle of combat to restore hearts, perform the perfect guard and perfect dodge, lock on to only one enemy at a time, spin attack, charge attack, jump slash, bow attack, throw weapons, and switch in between one-handed and shield, two-handed and spear. I found myself utilizing more diverse strategies this time around compared to Breath of the Wild, and I discovered that groups of enemies were far more prominent in Tears of the Kingdom, and required to be dealt with differently and more strategically. The most efficient way to do this was elemental attacks. This means, however, keeping a close eye on your resources, such as your arrows, your items that can cause burn, freeze, or electrocution. Spears continue to be the best weapon to deal with low HP units, as they keep forces at bay and provide the player with the quickest attacks. One change I'll mention just briefly is the removal of elemental wands from Breath of the Wild and the introduction of wands mixed with elemental stones. I could not imagine a larger waste of a valuable gem than turning it into a wand though. Let's now discuss a sticking point for Tears of the Kingdom. Lights of Blessing. Instead of implementing a different, less tedious or more subtle way to increase health and stamina, the developers just copied and pasted from Breath of the Wild. Despite what most avid fans would say about Breath of the Wild, its shrines became tedious and monotonous by the second playthrough. I will give Tears of the Kingdom massive credit for implementing far more interesting shrines than Breath of the Wild did. It's really what Breath of the Wild should have been. But the choice to implement the same structure to increasing stamina and health is a misstep. I know that's such a basic way of putting it, but I can't find a more fitting word for it. Pre-Breath of the Wild, the player would be rewarded heart pieces for finishing dungeons or fun side quests. What Tears of the Kingdom continues from Breath of the Wild is the philosophy that you should grind for heart pieces and stamina vessels. When you played the previous titles, it was the dungeons and the item progression that spurred you on, and during the time you'd take to complete the dungeons and explore for better items, your heart containers would go up after each significant dungeon or after completing the fun few side quests or exploring areas. In Tears of the Kingdom, you have to go out of your way to specifically choose to get more. It's not woven naturally into your adventure like previous Zelda games. It's a chore and it's a grind. And while the shrine puzzles are far better compared to Breath of the Wild, there's no excuse for continuing this flawed method of acquiring more health and stamina. I was less critical for Breath of the Wild using this design philosophy because they were trying something new, and for some it was tolerable, but it's simply poor design to re-implement this design philosophy. Plus, they don't even try hard to mask that they've done the same thing. Calling them lights of blessings instead of spirit orbs? Why bother? And you still need exactly 4 of them for some reason? While I'm ranting about poor copy and paste jobs from Breath of the Wild, why did they bring back Korok seeds? Who likes these? Seriously. I know there's some people to claim to like them, but I'm convinced they've done so in order to avoid admitting that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have a flaw, and they wish to remain in ignorance about their favourite game. But anyone with common sense understands how terrible a system Korok seeds are, and now there's more of them! By the time you get 50, it's far too tedious to hunt down more to expand your inventory. Plus, the mini puzzles you solve aren't fun, just time wasting. Again, Breath of the Wild tried to implement something new and interesting so they could be forgiven for missing the mark. Tears of the Kingdom has no such defense. Who apart from the most sycophantic fans think Korok seeds are a good idea? I just cannot fathom someone of a reasoned mind believing that they needed to return in any shape or form. Additionally, rain returns, but unlike the previous 2 examples, Tears of the Kingdom implements ways to get around it with potions and meals that decrease slip, clothing that decreases slip, and the previously mentioned ascent power that can come in handy when climbing is impossible. This is how you implement improvement from a previous title, not blindly copying and pasting the same thing again, but actively identifying the issue and providing players with strategies to overcome it. Moving on to the unique changes in Tears of the Kingdom, we have the introduction of Zonai technology. The player will regularly run into relics of the ancient Zonai civilization, which play an important role in Link's adventure. They can come in the form of enemies with a different type of constructs, as well as charges that aim to power energy cells used to power the player's creative constructions and ingredients for device dispensers. These dispensers have a wide variety of capsules that players can utilize at any time in their adventure. These are a particularly fun addition to the game and continue with what I believe is the game's philosophy of creating fun inside of a massive playing ground. Along with this technology is the typically underground resource of Zonite, which is used to pay for extra energy wells. I'm a bit embarrassed to say that it took me until I was practically finished my first playthrough before I discovered you could do this. Yes, I was using Zonite devices with only 1 energy cell the entire time. We also have the return of Pose from the previous Zelda titles. In Tears of the Kingdom, they are collectibles that serve as a currency at bargainer statues for valuable items and equipment. Less important to mention is the return of cooking pots, weather like thunderstorms, cold and hot temperatures, wind gusts, and electricity. Now, the obvious comparison to make with Tears of the Kingdom is its similarity to Breath of the Wild. This is natural for players to do with the previous title in any series. But there are 2 other comparisons I wish to make. The first point of comparison is the transition from Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask. There were a few like me who wished for more out of Breath of the Wild, those who wanted a more traditional Zelda-like experience. I mean, what kind of Zelda fan would I be if I only liked Breath of the Wild? I personally enjoyed a lot from Breath of the Wild, and believe that the basic design of Breath of the Wild could be reused with improvements for the sequel, similar to how Majora's Mask reused assets, models, among other things, from Ocarina, but implement a different experience and make improvements to areas that were lacking in Breath of the Wild. Did this happen? I'd say it's about 50-50. As mentioned previously, the shrine puzzles and temples, in quotation marks since they weren't your traditional Zelda temples, were by far the best improvement to the game. Even though the same surface world is used, it changed enough that I didn't feel bored going through the same locations. I'd also argue that the music improved as well, but this isn't the music section, so on to the next thing. Upgrading gear has become more tedious and resource consuming. It's not immediately clear how to release the Great Fairies to upgrade your gear. Eventually you are tasked with completing 4 side adventures in order to access the Great Fairies, which possess a problem for me, as you should really be allowing the player to access gear upgrades early. If I understand this correctly, you have to go to the Lucky Clover Gazette in order to start off all the quests, a location which is a fair bit out of the way. Inevitably, a player could wander the map for dozens of hours without the foggiest idea of how to get higher than 10 defense, which is a massive problem for a player's survivability. I can't understand why devs wanted to make this more difficult. Also, it feels like more resources are needed, but I could be wrong. On top of the rupee costs for each upgrade, it contributes to an overall feeling of bad pacing in the game. I get it. It's all about player freedom, but the choice to make this process more difficult and time-consuming is mind-boggling to me. Along with this, I found that the shrine puzzles were at most times far better, and yet at the same time potentially more painful. In previous Zelda titles, including Breath of the Wild, when you finally had the aha moment and you solved a puzzle, you'd make it happen and be on your way to the next one. However, in Tears of the Kingdom, there can exist a massive gap between solving a puzzle and completing it. It's very frustrating to sit there and try angle after angle on some ball-throwing device or some other contraption, knowing full well you already know how to do it, but having to wait through the tedious process of getting the angle just right in order to progress. It's very frustrating game design. Also, what's the deal with the random bouts of fogs that obscure the view of the player? It was especially prominent in the Sky Islands, but not exclusive to it. I found it also occurring in caves as well. I don't get the purpose of having a rolling fog making it difficult to see what the hell I'm doing. It doesn't add anything to the game. I'm not more immersed. I'm just annoyed that you've extended my gameplay time for no reason. I get it that some parts like Dragonhead have to be awful vision-wise because it's a problem to solve, but how do I solve the fog problem that exists all over Hyrule? While most changes bring positive moves forward for Zelda, there are some very questionable design choices. Unfortunately, mechanically the game is very similar to Breath of the Wild, whereas with Majora's Mask, that simply cannot be said when comparing to Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask, while using the same assets, was tonally a massive shift. It was the darkest Zelda title at the time, and was very distinct from Ocarina of Time. That's not to say Ocarina of Time didn't have its dark undertones, because it did. If you've ever seen the video Ocarina of Time, a masterclass in subtext by the channel Good Blood, which I suggest checking out, you'll see how darker themes are often woven into Ocarina of Time's story without it being at the forefront of the game. Despite this, Majora's Mask's darkness is front and center, and it starts immediately when coming across the butler's son, then hearing the Song of Healing. It really smacks you over the head with it. Plus, the focus of the game mechanics is far removed from Ocarina of Time. While there's the same item progression, there are now masks that drastically change Link and allow for various unique powers that allow Link to interact with the environment in diverse ways. It took risks. Breath of the Wild took risks. Tears of the Kingdom simply does not. While comparisons can be drawn between these two sets of games, there are some glaring differences. Ocarina of Time was one of the first 3D adventures and set many trends for that genre for years to come. It was a pioneer of a new platform and genre of game. Sure, Breath of the Wild was a pioneer of the new Nintendo Switch, but it was still a 3D game, and it was an open world game at that. Something that had already been done for over a decade when it was released. While it was difficult to point to another 3D adventure game and say they did the same thing better than Ocarina of Time at the time of its release, It was quite easy to point to other open world games and argue that Breath of the Wild could have implemented characters better, or side quests better, or the story better. In comparison, Ocarina of Time was the king of 3D adventure games when it was released. And despite what Breath of the Wild's most avid fans may say, Breath of the Wild was not the king of open world games. It was very much late to the party, and it lacked features of popular open world games that were released years before it. It didn't pioneer anything. Except for maybe its physics engine, that was quite impressive. The point I'm making is that Majora's Mask could not possibly follow in Ocarina of Time's footsteps. It had to stand on its own. It had to be different. And boy was it different. Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, is an enhanced version of Breath of the Wild. I haven't touched Breath of the Wild since playing Tears of the Kingdom, and I don't know if I ever will. Why would I? How is Breath of the Wild better in any way? How is it significantly different? It's just not. And this brings me to the third game, or sets of games, I wish to compare it to. The transition between Pokemon Sun and Moon and Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. I don't know how many of you are Pokemon fans, but upon playing through my first completed Tears of the Kingdom playthrough, I had flashbacks to my feelings towards Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. These Pokemon games came out a year after the original Pokemon Sun and Moon, and were in short, a copy and paste job. It was the exact same story, it had the exact same mechanics, the exact same annoying interruptions and cutscenes, with an extra character thrown in and a fan service postgame on top. It was at this time when I stopped purchasing new Pokemon games and started buying them secondhand so my purchases wouldn't register for Nintendo sales. I had enough of Pokemon's greed and refusal to innovate at that point. Now Tears of the Kingdom is not that bad, but it's not far enough away from it for my liking. It's closer to the Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon comparison than it is to the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask comparison, and that's a massive problem. How can I give credit to a game that borrowed so many features from its predecessor? How can I give credit to a game's tone when it's copied and pasted from the previous title? I can't, and I won't. So keep that in mind when I give the game my final score. I will discuss further comparisons during the world and lore section of this review, but for now, let's move on to music and sounds. Unlike the game design philosophy, the music saw a stark tonal change from its predecessor. The main theme is a call to adventure in the style of previous epic Zelda tracks, like the Telltale Heights from Link's Awakening, or the overworld theme from Zelda 1. This callback to the Zelda adventures of old piqued the interest of so many when it was revealed in the very first trailer for Tears of the Kingdom. It cannot be understated how important music is to the Zelda series. In my Breath of the Wild review, I made criticisms regarding the choices made for the soundtrack, and that it was missing more immersive tracks. That is not the case for Tears of the Kingdom's soundtrack. By the end of the main theme, there's a hint at the subterranean terror that is revealed within the opening minutes of the game. And boy, did they nail the music in the opening minutes. The way it builds to a crescendo as you approach the source of gloom is both nerve-wracking and immersive. Gone are Breath of the Wild's tracks focusing on openness and absences of sound. You're whisked away to another world, deep beneath Hyrule Castle, wondering at what fear-inducing monster you'll come across. I mean, we know because we watched all the trailers, but still, we can pretend. During a recent playthrough in which I was making notes for the review, the very second thing that came to mind was that the music had a massive upgrade. It's so prominent, it stands on its own 2 feet rather than leaning heavily on the absence of sound or previous Zelda tracks. If you don't know what I mean by absence of sound, I explained it better in my Breath of the Wild review, so check that out. But basically, Breath of the Wild took previous Zelda tunes and just deleted random parts of the tracks in random spots. The soundtrack succeeded where Breath of the Wild failed. Overworld music. Breath of the Wild's overworld music was, well, not very musical. It was random piano jingles inadvertently spaced over several seconds of nothing. This time around, it adds a little bit more to the tracks, but that little bit more makes all the difference. The Sky Islands track does not do a lot on its own. It won't be a track that I'll download and listen to like other Zelda tracks, but it paints a somewhat successful picture of the mood of Link first waking up on an unknown and mysterious Sky Island, surrounded by unfamiliar things. There is a borrowing from previous Zelda tracks, like in the Temple of Time track, but it's changed to fit into the pattern of the Tears of the Kingdom's overall soundtrack, as if it's an important piece of a much larger puzzle, making it unique from previous games, but also fitting in with the overall theme of the soundtrack, staying true to the tone of Tears of the Kingdom. Another area that set Tears of the Kingdom apart from Breath of the Wild is the addition of caves and depths, along with the skyline islands I mentioned earlier. The music that accompanies these places is a tonal shift from the overworld tracks. In fact, they are tonally different to each other, a stark difference from Breath of the Wild, where the same piano jingle would play in various locations. In Tears of the Kingdom, the soundtrack is communicating that what you've just entered is a different world. The mood is different, the environment has changed, you're not safe. The track Dive into the Depths, and the depths illustrates this perfectly. It works to immerse the players into a new location. Just imagine the missed opportunity if they had pulled a Breath of the Wild and just had the piano jingle play instead. There are returning tracks, such as Master Koga, Kakariko Village, and Eterno Village, which is to be expected, I suppose. What I did enjoy was the tunes that had been edited from the previous title, like Tarry Town, and the way the Lost Wood sounds when filled with gloom, or how Rito Village sounds when frozen over. Excellent edits to songs that depict the atmosphere far better than Breath of the Wild did. It changes such a happy-go-lucky tune into something far more ominous and saddening. Just a classy edit. Additionally, the boss battle songs were a return to form for Tears of the Kingdom, mimicking some of the great tracks from previous titles. Speaking of a return to form, the temple tracks also consisted of immensely immersive tracks. Gone are the similar aesthetics and soundtracks of the Divine Beasts. Each temple, while similar gameplay-wise to Breath of the Wild, had a unique atmosphere with a soundtrack that complemented it. You can hear the unique region music along with the implementation of the gloom music. It shows that you're in a grand challenge, but don't forget who the big baddie is. Be ready. While I love the call to action music like any other Zelda fan, Tears of the Kingdom demonstrates its ability to know when to be sincere and when to build an emotional climax. When there's full-on action, the soundtrack knows. When there's a lull in the story, the soundtrack knows. When it wishes to be a bit fun, it takes you on that journey as well. The soundtrack is a vast improvement from Breath of the Wild, but I will give credit Breath of the Wild in one place: the music of the climax. I mentioned it in my Breath of the Wild review, how the Hyrule Castle theme plays perfectly into the mood and the tone of the final assault on the castle by Link. Similarly in Tears of the Kingdom, Link's final assault on Ganondorf beneath the castle also contained amazing music. Now we have to mention it: the voice acting. Is it better than Breath of the Wild? No. Is it worse? No. I don't feel there's a lot to talk about with this. They chose to have the voice acting, so you would expect them to pull it off well. In my Breath of the Wild review, I compared it to Dragon Quest XI, which has a great localization team that managed to knock the voice acting out of the park. Zelda could also achieve this, but it doesn't. They would obviously had to reuse the same voice actors that portrayed the characters in the previous title. What can you do? If the voice acting is important to you, do what people online suggest. Change it to Japanese. It's fair to say the English voice acting is mediocre. But is there anyone who isn't skipping them after your first playthrough? On to world and lore. In my Breath of the Wild review, I observed that the world was too large for the lack of interesting locations that existed within it. Well, Tears of the Kingdom went bigger, but did the points of interest increase? In short, yes. Littered throughout the world are caves which possess a wide variety of treasures to find. Above the surface are sky islands, which possess dozens of shrines, monsters, as well as maps to treasures, and the all-important Sage's Will items. Beneath the surface, there is a world equal to the surface, with its own challenge, treasures and mysteries to solve. Traversing the entirety of the 3 worlds of Tears of the Kingdom is quite a task indeed. I managed to do it twice, finding all shrines and light routes, so I feel I'm in fairly good position to judge the necessity of these 3 massive maps. You know what? Necessity is the wrong word for it. Of course the entire map is not necessary. That's the whole point of an open world adventure, with the freedom to choose your own path. But does each region have a purpose? In Breath of the Wild, regions such as the Hebra region only existed to be a dumping ground for shrines and Koroks. What also didn't help is that the regions didn't have a solid theme, apart from the very basic weather differences. In other open world games, you might have one region with the epicenter being a port city, with trading playing a big part of not only the town, but your interactions with NPCs. Outside the city, there might be a lot of caravans moving through, small towns littered with exotic goods, and a diverse array of people travelling through. Good world building understands that things don't happen in isolation. But Tears of the Kingdom, like its predecessor, does not understand this. The Hebra region is still the snowy region, of which there are 2 with no other distinctions. The Hyrule Ridge region exists, but what's its characteristics? What is it known for? I'll tell you what it's most known for, being the place in between Central Hyrule and Rito Village. That's it. Now there are regions that have more to it than that. The Gerudo Desert is a desert region, but it also has a distinct culture, architecture, and history to unravel. There still exists some major swings and misses when it comes to the world building of Tears of the Kingdom, and it wasn't helped by borrowing so heavily from Breath of the Wild. When all an entire region has to go on is its physicality, then the question you must ask is, does it need to exist? There are more things to interact with this time around, but more for the sake of more is not good game design or immersive. It often takes you out of the journey if the player feels like they're just walking through empty space with no significance to it. I'd just go outside to a park and walk around if I wanted that experience. To give an example of what I mean, I'll compare it to another open world game I'm sure we're all aware of, Skyrim. If I go to the Winterhold region, I'm going to be greeted by lots of snow. Now that's half the map of Skyrim, so it really needs to stand out in another way, and it chooses to do this by being a place where the college exists, a place for mages to go and train. Now it could just stop there. It's one of the smallest of the regions in the game, so it doesn't need to offer too much, but this theme of a place for mages and their magic exists throughout the region, adding to its realism and immersion. For example, you can come across a mage who has burnt themselves to a crisp for trying to experiment with a spell. There's a jail that you can be sent to, guarded by magical conjurations. There are ruins used for magical experiments. There are mages who have isolated themselves in strange places to work on their own investigations. It's a region that continually links to a greater theme, and makes it far more interesting because of that. If you take these points of interest out of Winterhold, and remove the college and the town, but keep the random locations, that's what the Hebra region is in Tears of the Kingdom. It's not the only region to do this, but it's the most guilty of this, and it hasn't changed since Breath of the Wild. But within the game, there are still examples of how to do this well. I pointed to the Gerudo Desert before, the town at the epicenter of the region under siege. There's a gigantic temple hidden underground. There's hints to ancient Gerudo civilizations, both on the surface and in caves littered throughout the region. There's a believable history to it that runs throughout the region that keeps the player immersed and interested. It's not alone in this achievement though, it is one of the best at doing it. The other regions that tend to do well are the ones that have divine beasts. I mean temples. Yeah, easy mistake to make since it's the same problem as Breath of the Wild. Also, the temples are not your traditional Zelda temples. They're still structured like divine beasts where you must activate 5 or so special contraptions in order to fight the boss. But at least they have unique designs and bosses now. Woohoo! The lack of region designs or themes can also affect other areas like side quests. If the side quests fit into the lore of the region I'm in, I'm likely to be far more interested in doing it. However, there are far too many side quests, side adventures, whatever you call it, in which you could pick up an NPC, put them in any other location across the world of Hyrule, and it wouldn't affect the side quest one bit. Open world games have been doing this better for well over a decade now, and I just can't place my finger on why the side quests from previous Zelda games are far more interesting to me. Does it have to do with the NPCs that give the quests being far more unique, memorable, and expressive? Possibly. The NPCs in Tears of the Kingdom, and likewise Breath of the Wild, seem rather formulaic. There's definitely exceptions, but it just feels different. Leave your thoughts in the comments below if you know what I mean, or if I'm way off. As expansive as the worlds of Tears of the Kingdom are, it's the little individualized experiences that make the world immersive. Take the opening. You're thrown in straight away to something mysterious that continues to build as you slowly walk forward. Your excitement begins to get the better of you as Zelda tries to communicate to you about the lore of the upcoming game, but you don't care about her interruptions. You just want to get to the source of the gloom. Also, gloom? Really? They knew they couldn't do Malice again, so they just called it Gloom and changed its aesthetics. Only slightly. Come on, Nintendo. Stop copying and pasting. It's 2023. Now, it's at the beginning where it's implied that this is a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, that it exists in the same exact universe. You see it by the way Zelda is completely in love with the heroics of the silent protagonist, asking him if he's okay after fighting 3 keys. Of course I'm okay. You saw me fight Beast Ganon. But there's a lot of hints throughout the adventure that this world is not in fact the same one as Breath of the Wild. One example of this, where are all the guardians and divine beasts? I can understand that they want to get rid of them, but there isn't much trace of them or the divine beasts, which would be very hard to hide. Add on to that the perspective of another dragon that has apparently existed since the first king of Hyrule, as well as the Sky Islands that are hard to miss, and we begin to wonder what universe this world is actually in. According to the story, the gloom is created or spawns from the Demon King version of Ganondorf, and we see the original gloom create all the baddies across the land. Does this mean bokoblins didn't exist before Ganondorf's transformation? We see a memory in which Moldugas exist pre-transformation. Are they the exception? Or do they all exist and Ganondorf has the power to create more? If so, why? I have so many questions. I do enjoy how the game invites you to ask these questions through the memories and the mysteries of the world. Sadly, in case you missed it, Zelda specifically states these questions as well, just in case you're confused or you didn't get it the first time. Thanks, Zelda. Within the beginning of the game, we're introduced to a new civilization known as the Zonai, a mysterious sky people with advanced technology that decide to descend to the surface. Ganondorf in one of the memories hints at knowing they exist, so again, maybe this is a different universe. The Zonai architecture becomes a replacement for the Sheikah architecture from Breath of the Wild, but it's applied to the new world more intelligently than before. It isn't as prominent as the Sheikah, and it doesn't stand out. You don't get sick of looking at it in each shrine unlike before. The Zonai's unique presence in Tears of the Kingdom add to the immersion of the player into the world and the story more fully than Breath of the Wild, which is a massive step up. While we do eventually unravel the mystery of why Ganondorf was held captive underground, the lead up at both the beginning and end of the main story was very reminiscent of Ocarina of Time's final showdown with Ganondorf. And it's a great reward to finish the game fully and come back to a second playthrough being able to say, okay, I know why that's happening. But with genuine investment in the story, rather than Breath of the Wild's bland structure and characters that made me not give a hoot about why they were in bad position, or in the case of the Zora, not believe they were in a bad position just because it was raining. Tears of the Kingdom alleviates that concern quite a bit, if not fully. While things have definitely improved, it's a bit frustrating to find that other things have stayed the same or regressed. Many things I've mentioned already that have been a cut and paste job, but after the amazing opening, you run straight into the exact same setup. A dead king has tasked you with seeking out 4 shrines, each of which will give you a unique power before you are able to explore the world. I still believe wholeheartedly in what I said in my Breath of the Wild review. The Great Plateau is the greatest video game tutorial of all time. So Tears of the Kingdom were never going to top it, so why design it in the exact same way? Another legacy from Breath of the Wild is how the game communicates quite clearly to you how much you haven't explored yet. This is just a really poor design choice in an open world game. And just like in Breath of the Wild, there are defenders of the game who will say, oh, you don't have to go to all the shrines, you don't have to do all the light routes, you don't have to explore every region, you don't have to explore every cave, it's an open choice for you. Then why does the game tell you these things? We know there's 152 shrines, and thus there are 152 light routes. We know how many regions we have and haven't received the map for. We are told by Colton how many caves there are left to explore, as well as another character who tells us how many wells we haven't explored. If it wasn't important to the player to complete these, then why are we being told this information? Take my reference to Skyrim from before. Imagine if there was a character that told the Dragonborn every so often how many locations were left to be explored. It would completely kill the experience, because it's a reminder that you're in a game with a finite number of locations. That's a really dumb move in an open world game where the point of the genre is to make players feel like it's endless, like there's always something else out there. You don't just tell the player how many locations are left, because it leads to 2 main reactions. One of burden, having many more to complete, or one of disappointment at all the locations you're going to skip. Tears of the Kingdom hasn't even been out for 6 months, and I can tell you how many wells there are, how many caves there are, how many shrines and light routes there are. Skyrim has been out for over 10 years, and I wouldn't have a clue as to how many locations there are. Guess which one feels more like an immersive world to me? Moving on to characters. It was great to see Sidon and Riju again. Giving them even more prominence along with the other sages made the adventure more compelling when compared to rescuing long dead heroes in Breath of the Wild. I felt far more compelled to help the main characters this time around. Gerudo Town was no longer plagued by some wind and sand, they were fighting for their very survival. The danger teach of the 4 main regions was far more interesting and satisfying to complete. The voice acting of some of the characters was distracting at times and could take away from the immersion, but I ended up thoroughly enjoying solving each region's problems and having another ally by my side. And when they all come together at the end, mwah. While the main characters all get the tick of approval from me, some of the side characters cause me to raise an eyebrow. Did anyone else notice the noises the Great Fairy makes, or the trader at Central Hyrule? I really don't understand that design choice. And do we really need to have that dialogue with Bede every time we want to buy something from him? No, I'm not selling you this freaking Rhino Beetle, stop asking! Overall, it's still a positive experience with the characters, with some weird interactions mixed in. It would be remiss of me not to discuss the depths. This is something else. I absolutely love the concept. A massive underground world with mysterious creatures and incredible treasures to find. I could not be more excited. Its sheer size weighs heavily on you when you first visit this location. Personally, I found it better to explore it in smaller chunks, so not to be overwhelmed. I do enjoy that there is a lot on offer regarding places to go and the special Yiga locations that exist throughout, but I especially like the connection the devs tried to make between the depths and the Sky Islands through the use of the old maps. The worst thing they could have done was make each world feel disjointed from one another, so I applaud this small attempt to mix them together. The abandoned mines offered heaps of resources, with some being sources of important clothing items that were once only available through amiibos. Though, the more I explored, the more I experienced feeling robbed when I come across a treasure chest sitting at the bottom of a mine, only for it to provide 20 crystals rather than a clothing item. Got myself all excited for nothing. In my third playthrough, I attempted to avoid the depths to see how useful it was to the journey, but the story makes you go there at least twice in order to progress the main story. Yes, I know you can go straight to Ganondorf, but I'm referring to the main stories here. In fact, you cannot get the sensor without first going underground twice, once before beating the temple and once after. Apart from that, however, there's not a huge need to go underground. The best reason would be your battery or cells. Having only one set of 3 of these will leave you with very little time with your constructs, which make traversing the world that little bit more difficult. Overall, my experience of the depths is a positive one, though I wouldn't recommend exploring it all. It can become monotonous after a while, and exploring in the dark can be painful. Also, the frogs can just appear out of nowhere, a bit of a clip-in problem there. If I had to make a comparison to Breath of the Wild, I'd say that Tears of the Kingdom far exceeds in the world and lore, and I'm confident in saying that the majority of players would agree with me there. Which makes me wonder how many could give Breath of the Wild a 10 out of 10. So what's Tears of the Kingdom then? 15 out of 10? Not quite in my opinion. To summarise, in my Breath of the Wild review, I criticise it for being too large, for not offering the content that those of us who have played open world games have come to expect from them. Well, with Tears of the Kingdom, they've more than doubled it in size, and while it's made plenty of positive steps forward in the genre of open world games, it still has more steps to take. For long-time Zelda fans, this game may be bittersweet. It is still a top-tier game that has much love and effort poured into it, but the Zelda series has had a tremendous shift away from what made it beloved by many in the first place. Will those of us who have loved Zelda for over 20 years no longer be able to enjoy item progression or incredible dungeons, and forever be forced to experience disjointed puzzles and massive overworlds with unreachable amounts of collectibles? Only time will tell. There are many improvements made since Breath of the Wild's release, but with those improvements also come a lot of features that stayed the same, or in some cases, got worse. This review scores The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom a 7.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching this thorough review. Please give me some love with a like and a comment below. It's much appreciated. If you'd like more thorough reviews, you can subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and farewell.